King, comfort of the Spirit, true to give word, President, full of all things, treasure of blessings, and giver of life. Come and abide us and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O God. One thing that's important to realize is that the church has been corrupt since day one. Yeah, Judas, with his hand in the till, and so forth. That's right. So there's always been corruption in the church, always will be, till the second coming of the world. So, what I wanted to cover today, we talked last week. We talked essentially about the development of monasticism and the effects of the introduction of the Philokalia and the other books by that were translated by St. Paisiewicz-Kowski, the revival of eldership, and how that also inspired Russian culture in the 19th century. It inspired philosophy, it inspired writers, especially like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and many other great writers. But it also was it was a somewhat limited phenomenon. There was so much else going on, and on one hand there was this great outpouring of sanctity through this the reintroduction of eldership and through the reintroduction of hesychasm into the life of the church. Brian, could you turn on the fans, please?
How do you spell Philokalia?
Spell what?
I don't know.
Philokalia, Philo, Kalia. It's 5 volumes, and it contains selections from the writings of the fathers on the prayer of the heart and on watchfulness, dating from the 3rd century through the 15th century. So this remained a movement, and it remained fairly strong, actually, up until the Russian Revolution. Of course, with the Russian Revolution, the communists martyred most of the monks and spiritual fathers, or they were thrown into the gulag. But it was a great outpouring of sanctity. On the other hand, there was a lot of very bitter and brutal developments within Russia as well, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And it coincided with the emancipation of the serfs, the Industrial Revolution hitting Russia, and this massive influx of people into the cities, which essentially made them rootless and homeless. And it was a social and political disaster, and it left the door open for radical socialism, for nihilism, for atheism, for hatred of the monarch and the monarchy, for hatred of society. Hatred of the upper classes, and just in general, which in general was fueled by despair. So you had both of these going on at the same time at the end of the 19th century, and it was really the end of the 19th century that where the fruit of this Paisian revival started to come on. But just kind of a broad overview of what was happening in the West at this time. Of course, in 1776 was the American Revolution. In 1789 was the French Revolution, which pushed the whole idea of egalitarianism, was rabidly anti-monarchical, and allegedly democratic. It was anti-clerical, but it also, as if also a kind of a preview of what was to come in the whole socialist agenda, radical anti-Christian, and anti-church. So churches were burned and looted, and clerics were killed, and it was a very brutal thing. The French Revolution was not a happy thing. Now,
there is no revolution that is a happy thing.
No, no. Well, the American Revolution was nowhere near as bloody.
Yeah, it's true.
But it's one thing when you have the overthrow of a colonial power that's located thousands of miles away. It's another thing when you're overthrowing the ancien regime, you know, which has been the organic government of the society for forever, you know, for hundreds of years. So, but both the French Revolution and the American Revolution introduced secularism into the political equation of what was going on. Now, much of Europe rejected this at the time, and was trying to hold on to, you know, various versions of their traditional monarchy or something. But of course, secularism eventually would prevail. But what this revolutionary spirit produced was a radical transformation of society, and it was a violent de-Christianization of society. Mm-hmm. You know, even in the American Revolution, where there wasn't this brutal reaction against the churches, there was still this separation of church and state, in which the established church was de-established, and we can probably next week we'll talk about, you know, some of the American religious history. The first great revival and Great Awakening, which was in the mid-1700s, and then the Second Great Awakening, which produced a whole different religious scene by the end of, as they played themselves out. Just after the turn of the 19th century, or at the turn of the 19th century, Napoleon took over in France, and he tried to bring some order, but there were a whole set of wars which he waged, and he was defeated by the Russians and turned back, and finally he was defeated at Waterloo and exiled. But it just created chaos in Europe. Now, at the same time, on the other end of the European continent, you had the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire. So in 1825, you had the Greeks declared independence. There's a reason that the Greek flag is blue and white, and has a cross on it, is because the independence was declared on the Feast of the Annunciation, where the vestments were blue and white, and so essentially what they were doing is running vestments up the flagpole, because it was, you know, and of course it was a Christian revolution against Islam, and so they, so this very Christian symbol was used. This paved the way for the development of actually of the Greek autocephalous church, where the church in Greece was not only separated from the previous organization within the Ottoman Empire, where the Patriarchate of Constantinople controlled all the Christian communities within the Ottoman Empire, called the Millet, but it became completely independent of Constantinople. Now, Constantinople has never thrown off the Ottoman or the Turkish yoke. It's still under the Turkish yoke now, and this is one of the factors that's affecting all the politics going on today. But gradually the Balkans freed themselves. The Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, the Albanians, of course, the Greeks, were able to send the Ottomans packing, and what evolved was the development of the modern nation state. Of course, under the Ottomans, you had ethnic groups, you had nations in that sense, not of a political entity, but of an ethnic entity. And these developed political structures, and the whole concept of nationalism fused ethnic identity and agenda with a national, or with a political agenda for autonomy of these ethnic groups. So you have the same thing go on with the Serbs. The Serbs, it's a little bit different history than Greece. The Serbs held on a little bit longer than Constantinople. They didn't fall until 1466 instead of 1453. And they got their patriarchate back after 100 years or so. It had all been dissolved under the Ottomans and put under the Millet, and then they lost it again. And it remained, they basically didn't have full control over their own church until something like the 1860s. Romanians, Bulgarians, I don't know the specific history, but it would be a similar story. Now, the Serbs and the Bulgarians had ancient patriarchates, had been patriarchates, and had been autocephalous churches since the 9th century or thereabouts. Then Russia became, well, actually, the 9th century, the Bulgarians became Christian. The 10th century, the Russians became Christian. They didn't get autocephalous churches immediately, but the Serbs and the Bulgarians had, and the Serbs in particular, had an autocephalous church very early.
Is that in Pech?
No, it was I don't remember. I think it was Ohrid.
Oh wow, okay.
The borders were totally different.
Yeah. I'm just wondering where the Patriarch of Pech came in.
I think in the 1300s.
Yeah.
So, each of these groups has a very complex history, and you can't assume that the contemporary borders have anything to do with the historic borders. Then you still have the dividing line between the East and the West, running straight through Serbia, because on the western side and north was Croatia, which is Roman Catholic, and on the eastern side was Serbia, including Montenegro and so forth, and that was Orthodox. And so there was all sorts of goings back and forth. But then you had these various populations, like in Bosnia and Albania and so forth, where the people had capitulated to the Muslims. So basically, Bosnians are Serbians who are Muslim, and they're all the same. It's all the same people: Bosnians, Serbians, Montenegrins, and so forth. But the Bosnians are Muslim, the Croatians are Roman Catholic, the Serbs are Orthodox. And Serbia, greater Serbia, extended way beyond the borders of what we consider to be Yugoslavia, or what was Yugoslavia. Then you have the Albanians down there, and the Albanians, I don't even know that history at all. But one of the things that's really interesting is the development of nationalism and its effect on the life of the church. So it was at the end of the Byzantine period, or towards the end of the Byzantine period, that these Balkan churches had developed. Then their independence was almost completely extinguished, and they were subjected to the Ottoman Millet once the Turks conquered the region. And remember, the Ottoman Empire went all the way to the Danube. So it went a long way into Europe, a long way, and they want it back too. And right now, what Yugoslavia was, that we knew that was put together after World War I, I think, was then carved up into 7 countries now, and now you have nationalism in these little countries that had never actually been nation states before. So, and one of the big political issues right now is over the state of Macedonia, or now I think they officially call it Northern Macedonia, which is better than Fyrom. But it's and the church there, because it was part of Yugoslavia. They speak their own language, which is kind of half Serbian, half Bulgarian, and with its own kind of, and there's lots of Albanian influence, but it's now its own country, and the church there was the Serbian Orthodox Church. Well, they declared independence from the Serbian Orthodox Church, so the Serbian Church designated them as a schism, and now they're trying to be recognized by the rest of the Orthodox Church. So they also have petitioned eventually. They went to the Bulgarians first. They also are petitioning Constantinople for recognition. So right now Constantinople is on the path of validating all these schismatic churches. So
and just bypassing the canonical ones.
Because canonically the Ukrainian schismatics can only be reconciled by the Russian Church, because they're in the territory of the Russian Church. The Macedonian schismatics can only be reconciled by the Serbian Church, because they're on the canonical territory of the Serbian Church, and so forth. It's a mess, and it doesn't help that now you've got secular politics involved, along with all the religious politics, and really what what this whole situation is, and what it's been since the 19th century, is this synthesis between nationalist agendas and politics and religion, so that the church has been actually subverted by nationalism. Now, in 1872, I believe, Constantinople, of all places, actually condemned a heresy called ethnophyletism, P-H-Y-L-E-T-I-S-M, and that's the organization of a church along ethnic lines, because it's a fundamental abrogation of the nature of Catholicity.
When was that? What was it?
1872. So America is a study in philetism. The Greek Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, the Antiochian Reed Syro-Lebanese Orthodox Church. You name it, and there are 15 of them.
Amazing.
Yeah. And that's precisely what's going on, for example, with this whole thing in Ukraine. You know, an ethnic, it's an ethnicity and a political entity being fusing together, and a religious political agenda being pushed, that the you know, actually the message of the church being subjugated and subverted for the sake of political ends, to create a nation state. So it's a very interesting thing. And it's especially it's an especial temptation within Orthodoxy, where you have all these local ethnic churches. Now, Constantinople, because it's so small and has all of these disparate dioceses, actually is not ethnophyletist, because it embraces all sorts of different people from all different languages, all different cultures, all different races and colors, and it's all kind of in the same church. The Russian church, because it's so huge, and the Russian church is the largest local church in the world of any kind. It's bigger than the Brazilian Catholic Church. It's bigger than, is also the experience is authentically Catholic. You go to Russia, and it is equally a melting pot as the United States, but it's a different mix. I mean, just look at the congregation here. You have people who look Scandinavian. You have people who look like Tartars, and Central Asians, and everything in between, and they're all Russians.
Yeah, we had German kings.
Yeah,
Queens. So it's
had German kings, and you know, and Russia is a kind of a fusion between Slavs, Vikings, and Finns. You know, all the northern tribes were Finns. You know, the Slavs were, you know, more around Kiev and Ukraine, and then you had the Vikings on the river, and then you had all these other little groups, and then as Russia expanded, so there's an old expression. Православный человек — это русский человек. An Orthodox person is a Russian person. If you're Orthodox, you're Russian.
All Russians.
Yeah. And this, but it's part of that imperial legacy that that was inclusive of all of these people who, you know, and not just Central Asians, but Far Eastern Asians and Native Americans and Eskimos, and there are a few Africans in Russia, but not many. And basically a few people who came as students to the Soviet Union and stayed. It's really unusual to see a black person in Russia. But there's every other shade of brown, basically. And you know, and so it's that aspect of the experience of being Orthodox in Russia is the only thing you can liken it to in this country is being Roman Catholic in this country, which has this absolute total mix of people from every socioeconomic status, from every racial, ethnic, and but otherwise many Orthodox parishes are Philatist. They're homogeneous ethnic communities, and that's just as a result of history. And it's one of the biggest challenges that we have for mission. That's why when somebody calls up and says, "Oh, I'm interested in Orthodoxy, where's the church?" It's like,
Where are you?
yeah, where are you in the first place? And is there a church that, for example, speaks English? My own experience in coming into the church. First church I picked was Rocor in San Diego. It was a little tiny church in a war zone, a drug gang war zone, in a little tiny house that was half converted into a church and still in progress. I walked in, there was this kind of makeshift iconostas. There was an ancient priest in with long white hair and long white beard and strange vestments, going on and on in this strange language. And two young girls in Russian peasant costumes with long golden braids, singing in this strange language. And several ancients of indeterminate sex, crossing themselves backwards and bowing to the ground. And I thought, this can't be it. Then I went to the Greek church, and I stood head and shoulders above everyone in the entire church. And there were like a couple hundred people there. And they were nice to me and gave me cookies, and I was 18, you know, and said, it's nice to have you, but you're not Greek, why are you here? Then I went to the Serbian church, and it was gorgeous. It's this exquisite little jewel in San Diego. And the entire thing is mosaic on the inside, and fantastic choir, and the priest was very nice, and he gave me books to read, and an English Serbian book to follow the service. But the people at coffee hour, they ignored me and said, "You're not Serbian, why are you here? You don't belong here." And I went to the OCA parish, and that was an adventure in itself. I called up, and the starosta answered the phone in Russian and said, "Oh, you don't speak Russian? We don't want you." And hung up.
That was a long time ago now.
That's not
Russian.
This was 1978. And
So what? You don't speak Russian.
there's more stories about that. And then there was I finally found the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate with a Mexican priest, and the only common language in the church was English.
Wow.
Because there were a couple of old babushki, there have to be a couple of old babushki, and a cat. That's the requirement for a Russian Orthodox church in California. 2 old babushki and a cat, and usually that's it. You know, maybe a priest, maybe not. And there were a bunch of Arabs, there were Palestinians, who didn't fit into the Syro-Lebanese Fight Club, which was 4 blocks down the road. There were some Romanians, and there were some actual Americans. And it was, wow, Americans can become Orthodox. So
There's hope.
there's hope. But it was quite an adventure. It's not quite so hard to become Orthodox nowadays. So, but this whole issue of philotism is huge, and it's this fusing of nationalism and kind of, you know, and religion.
Not a separation of church and state.
No. But I mean, you know, but quite frankly, Americans can be just as ethnocentric and philotistic. You know, try being a black guy and walking into a 30 years ago, walking into a white Episcopalian church in the suburbs. That wouldn't go over very well.
In Virginia?
Or a lot of places.
You know, the church was like a club for those that came from Russia for
Right.
the first immigration. Now it's completely different. They're all dead, almost all of them are dead.
Oh yeah, they're long gone.
It's just the one that came after the war that are here,
Mhm.
Father Victor and everybody. But it was exactly to be together and to speak the same language.
Right.
I don't know what they knew about Orthodoxy, by the way.
Some of them didn't know very much.
That's what I mean.
And actually many of the early churches in this country were incorporated as clubs.
Yeah.
And the priest is the religious advisor. And so like a club, you have to pay dues. You have to be approved by the board to become a member. Well, even here.
Yeah.
Even here.
Yeah.
You know, it's, you know, all these older churches, you know, from like before 1960, 1970 even, when things started to change a little bit. And Rocor is probably the most conservative of them. It's very problematic. You know, because this idea of the exclusive ethnic club, which doesn't admit fill in the blank, Russian, Serbian, Greek, so forth. But one of the things that's really valuable to know, and and you saw this in the OCA in particular, is that the can be equally as exclusive and ethnocentric, even when it comes to other Orthodox. It's not just a black guy walking into an Episcopal church 30 years ago. Try and be a Russian walking into an all-American, all-English church. You know, it's the same experience.
I'd be willing to run an experiment to go to just straight up 16. Go to the all-black Baptist church.
Yeah.
See how I was treated.
Mm-hmm.
Did they like you?
No, I'm saying I'd like to run an
you should.
experiment.
I bet they got a great
Document.
choir, you know.
I would too.
You can go together.
You want to go with me?
Not dressed like this.
Why not?
Why?
No, dress like this.
Okay. I'm game. Why not?
That's right. So anyway, this is a context. Now, in Russia at the time, in the mid 19th century. So we're going to get back to this, but this is, you know, this is kind of background leading up to this. In Russia, you had Tsar Alexander I from 1825 to 1855, who was very conservative. Then you had Alexander II, who was extremely important. He was the one who emancipated the serfs. He is the one who sold Alaska to the United States in 1867.
Oh.
And he was murdered by socialists in 1881. And this was that emancipation of the serfs happened right about the same time as Abraham Lincoln emancipated the slaves. And the two were, and there was communication going on between them. Marilyn can tell you all about that because she put together a museum exhibition on that included that.
Wow.
Some of the correspondence between Lincoln and Alexander II. The Russians also were partisans of the Union, and so they sent ships both into San Francisco Harbor and into New York Harbor to ward off incursions by the British and the French, who were supporting the Confederacy. Even though the first shot in the Civil War was fired by a Russian woman, and her picture was on the Confederate $20 bill. So, which is kind of interesting. I don't remember her name.
I think she actually was the daughter of one of our American envoys to St. Petersburg, and she was known as Dushka Pickens because she was baptized in St. Petersburg during the time that her father was, well, ambassador, but at that time they were envoys by title. And Alexander II actually came to her baptism and kept calling her Dushka, and it stuck. But I believe she was the one who fired first, because they were from, Pickens was from North Carolina.
South Carolina.
South Carolina.
Yeah.
So that's where was the first shot?
It was in South Carolina.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, so I mentioned that the emancipation of the serfs was a huge thing in Russia because all these people freed from their bond to the land flooded into the cities. Now most of them were uneducated, and so they were good for manual labor, but you know they're not skilled labor necessarily, and so it caused huge social problems, and because of that, it caused immense amounts of, ended up in immense poverty. And you can read all about that in the diaries of St. John of Kronstadt. But what that did is it prepared the ground for socialism to take root. That despair. Because basically socialism comes from, feeds off despair. And I think it's, you know, they're looking for a material, secular savior in the state, and of course it's a false god. Now, also at this time, in the church, earlier in the early part of the century, was Saint Philaret of Moscow. As he was the Metropolitan of Moscow. Now this was still the Romanov dynasty. There was still the persecution of the church by the elimination of the patriarchate, but the seizures of land and other things that were characteristic of the early Romanovs had stopped, and so there was this kind of truce between the emperor and the church. Now, under Peter and Catherine, there had also been a tremendous amount of westernization of the aristocracy primarily. And so you had this, the aristocracy was heavily alienated from the church. Some of them turned to Roman Catholicism, some of them turned to Protestantism. Most of them would speak French to one another, and there was a great disconnect between the aristocracy and the common people. There was essentially very little middle class. There was great wealth and there was great poverty, and not much in between. So it was a very kind of became a very volatile social mix. Now the church, especially people like St. John of Kronstadt, tried to minister to the poor. You know, seldom would he come home with a pair of shoes on, because he'd just give his shoes away, or his overcoat, whatever. He, just going out and visiting people, and it was a very difficult time. And so earlier on in the century, up until I believe around 1865, from about 1840 to 1865, you had Metropolitan Philaret of Moscow. He was the first hierarch of the Russian Church, who would have also been the chairman of the Synod of Bishops that reported to this lay Oberprocurator, administrator, who was the head of the church under the Romanov system, the synodal system. And he was, but Philaret was the beginning of, was a reformer. And he began some very important things. He had the Bible translated into Russian. Up until this time, it did not exist in the Russian language. It was only in Slavonic. This is like the 1840s or 50s when it was published. So that's a very substantial thing. And he was very much aware of this movement that had been started by Paisy Velichkovsky with the translation of the Philokalia and the transmission of traditional patristic teaching into Russia. And so what that did is it kind of morphed into a greater movement to translate the fathers of the church. Now at this time, the seminaries in Russia taught everything in Latin. So the seminarians, who meaning high school age, and had to learn to read, write, and speak Latin, because all the lessons were done in Latin, and they were using, to a great extent, they were using edited Roman Catholic textbooks. Now, what this means, and this is what and this goes back to Peter Mogila. Remember him? In the time of Peter Mogila, who's really the one who began the seminary system in the Russian Empire. And it wasn't just as in his time when you had the Orthodox using Roman Catholic arguments against Protestants and Protestant arguments against Roman Catholics. The very theology itself had morphed, and so it's what Father George Florovsky called the Latin captivity. Now the same thing happened in Greece at the same time. Only the Greeks didn't shake it off until the 1960s. But to a great extent, And remember, it wasn't until 1825 that the Greeks were free to teach theology. Everything, everything was under Turkish domination, and the number and quality of schools had been severely limited. So the only free Orthodox country from 1450 up until 1825 was Russia. Everything else was under Islamic domination from 1453. So it was a very dark and difficult period. Paisi Velichkovsky began this movement, continuing on the work of the Kolivadis fathers on the Holy Mountain, but he expanded it radically, and there began to be this intellectual and theological revival. And this was fed by the translation and publication of patristic texts from the Orthodox tradition into Russian.
Yeah, but you said they were studying in Latin and they just translated the Bible into Russian.
Right.
It's nonsense.
And it was not. It was, but that was the historical period. And so by the 1860s, you had the roots of what in the 20th century would be called the neo-patristic revival. And it came out of Russia.
Is that when they shook off the Latin domination?
That was when they began to shake off the Latin domination.
Okay.
Now, there were aspects of it where it still had not been shaken off, in various places. And even some of the textbooks from Jordanville reflected some of that old approach. They weren't in Latin, they were in Russian, or translated into English, but it reflected that old kind of scholastic approach and organization of thought into, and all the categories were lifted right out of Latin textbooks. So what happened spiritually in the monasteries was beginning to happen intellectually in the Russian church. And so the Russian church was really leading the way in the development of, in the return to the fathers, a return to the tradition of the Orthodox Church. Even though the theology was largely in Latin, through from the 17th through the 19th century, the liturgy remained the same. So it was the liturgy that maintained orthodoxy. And of course, before the revival under Paisius, the whole emphasis of the life of the church and even of the monasteries. Remember, I talked about how everything was very formal and external. In other words, it focused on the serving the services. So people would go to the services, and the services would be done in full, which meant hours and hours and hours and hours a day, like 8 hours a day of services. How you do that and get any work done is beyond me.
God does the work and you pray.
That would be nice. Tell the goats that need to be milked and the chickens that need to be, have their eggs gathered, and the cows that are in the field, and the garden that needs to be weeded. Not to mention the candles being made, the food cooked, and the prosra baked. and that's just the day-to-day kind of stuff. So, but that whole liturgical emphasis really guarded orthodoxy, both in Greece and in Russia. And it wasn't until until the Kolevadis in the Greek language and Paisi in the Romanian and Slavonic languages began the spiritual revival of monasticism, which also was a patristic revival, because the key book is the Philokalia, which is ancient fathers. And so this whole emphasis on patristic orthodoxy began to be developed. So, and then out of that, for example, came the Kuryevsky brothers, who were philosophers who were profoundly inspired by the monks of Optina, and who actually relocated to Optina monastery, so they could be near the monks, and their philosophy was about how to live an Orthodox life, but informed by the writings of the Holy Fathers. So return to the sources.
So when did they turn from Latin to Slavonic or Russian? I don't know. In this,
Probably
the school.
1850s, 1860s. So you know the synodal translation of the Bible. No, that comes from them. That was Philaret. Saint Philaret. Now, Saint Philaret of Moscow, had huge influence on the life of the church, intellectually, spiritually. Unfortunately, he also persecuted the old believers. But one of the most interesting things was that he was a mentor for two of the greatest missionaries the Russian church ever had. One was Saint Macarius of Altai, who went, and Altai is a range of mountains and high country on the border of Mongolia and northern and western China. Evidently a very, very beautiful area. And he went and he converted tens of thousands of people converted. And his spiritual father and great inspiration was Metropolitan Philaret of Moscow. The other was Saint Innocent of Alaska. And Saint Innocent has an incredible story. We talked a little bit about his earlier life last week. How he came to America at he was like a 23-year-old priest. He had his mother, he had his wife, he had his baby son, and got dumped off. And I was wrong about the location. It's essentially Dutch Harbor.
That's where a lot of the fishing emanates from.
Now, yeah. And he built the church by hand. He was they were dumped onto the shore with a pile of lumber. So here's your church, here's your house.
Go for it.
Build it. 1838, so 15 years later, he was back in St. Petersburg. He found his wife was with her family in Irkutsk. And he found out his wife had died, and and they still had young children. And he was persuaded by Metropolitan Philaret to take monastic vows and become a bishop. And so he was sent back to America as a bishop with the title of Kamchatka and the Kuril Islands and the Aleutians.
What is that, Kamchatka?
Kamchatka is that long peninsula
Oh, okay.
off of far western Siberia,
Right.
or eastern Siberia.
Yeah.
And he traveled all over his diocese. He came back in 1840. He spent 9 years in that diocese, and in the meantime he had learned several native languages, had transformed them into written languages, made them written languages, even published books in those languages, as well as books about those languages, and as well as all sorts of other kinds of scientific observations. And he was really a remarkable person. He visited the Russian colony in California, and he visited the Spanish missions around the Bay Area. Of course, he was able to speak Latin with the friars, and even, I think, for Mission San Jose, he created a barrel organ, or a, which...
It's a barrel organ.
A barrel organ, yeah. And he was quoted as saying that, and now those Catholic friars will be singing their hymns to merry Russian dance tunes.
He put those in along with the liturgical songs.
And so, and he actually made friends with the Spaniards, because there was relative peace at that time. It was just before California declared independence from Spain, and so he visited Fort Ross and other places, and then he visited all over Kamchatka and then Siberia. He next ended up in Yakutsk. Yakutsk is inland, several hundred miles from the coast, just to the north of China. But it's very cold there. I have a friend from Yakutsk. He told my assistant, "Oh, you must come visit us in Yakutsk, but you must come in the summertime, because if you come in the winter, you will die." Yeah, Misha now lives in Dallas and is very happy with the winters where it scarcely ever gets below freezing. So Saint Innocent, and as bishop, he oversaw the work of Father Saint Yakov Nitzvetov, who I talked about, who was the Aleut who missionized the Yupiks, the Athabascans, and the Tlingits. Right? I talked about him last week, right? Yeah. So there was a lot going on in Orthodox America at the time. Saint Innocent had a vision for Orthodoxy in America. He wanted to have the see moved from Sitka, which was the colonial capital, down to San Francisco. He wanted everything done in English, and for them to start converting the English-speaking Americans. And so he left America, went to take up the sea in eastern Siberia, was there for a while, and then went back to Russia, where he succeeded his spiritual father, Metropolitan Philaret, as Metropolitan of Moscow. And by this time he was nearly blind, and he could barely walk. He was almost 7 feet tall, and his time paddling around in a kayak in the Bering Sea, where the water is like 33 degrees, and with the only thing between you and the water being a sealskin, and then riding on every possible kind of conveyance and critter that can bear a human being throughout Siberia, especially in the wintertime. It ruined his health. However, when he got to Moscow, he organized the Russian Missionary Society, and it became a very popular organization for people to support and to publish and to assist the work of missions. And so the Russian Missionary Society especially took interest in the mission in America. So 1867, Alaska was sold by the Tsar to the Americans. I think they paid something like $2 million or something like that, which is a fair amount of money. It was like $200 million today, but still, I mean,
resources.
Yeah, and so it was just a few years later, in 1872, that the cathedral was established in San Francisco, or that the diocese was established in San Francisco as the cathedral for North America, and this is a very important thing. The parish in San Francisco was established in 1850. The only other parish that I know of that was established earlier in the United States was in New Orleans. Of course, in 1850 was the year that California came into the United States. While the clergy were provided by the Russians, most of the people were Greeks and Serbs and assorted other Orthodox from assorted and Americans. By 1872, it became the see of the bishop and the residence of the bishop, and they built a cathedral out near where Coit Tower is now, right in that area, which fell down in the 1906 earthquake, or it burned, or one of the two. By 1872, they were serving the liturgy, teaching and preaching in English. So St. Innocent had a big effect. And there was tremendous amounts of money coming from Russia, including imperial patronage, to support the work of the Church in America. Now, for example, the current historical cathedral in San Francisco is Holy Trinity Cathedral. It's in the hands of the OCA. The main bell has, was a donation from the Tsar. Yeah.
Wow.
And it was built with money from the Tsar. It was built after the earthquake and so forth. There are many other churches, both on the East Coast and a few on the West Coast, that were built under Russian imperial patronage, and through the work of the Missionary Society, which also supported the work of the clergy over here, Russian missionary priests. The establishment of Orthodoxy in the United States is something very important, not only as that the church came here, but it established a canonical foundation. Now, that's if you remember, the first bishop who was consecrated for America was Yosef, but he never made it. His ship sank in sight of land just off of Kodiak as he was coming back. He got all the way from St. Petersburg to Kodiak, and that was that. And so St. Innocent was the second bishop consecrated for North America. 40 years later, and he took a very active role in getting the church established and a foundation laid. And so, even for those who want to disregard the foundation of the church in Alaska in 1794 as a canonical foundation of the church, but how you can, I don't, even though, but it was, at the time it was still Russian territory. It was the Russian Empire. It's indisputable, basically, that the Russian Orthodox Church has canonical priority in North America through its mission.
Wasn't there some resistance of the friars in California against Saint Innocent?
Not particularly.
I remember you mentioning something that they had been, some of the Roman Catholics have been encouraged to kind of rise up against the spread of Orthodoxy.
Well, that was 100 years earlier.
Okay.
When Junipero Serra was sent to establish the missions of California, which were Spanish military outposts.
Okay.
And that's the reason the Spanish went into California, to claim it for the Spanish Empire. And they got as far as, well, at the
Bay Area.
Yeah, there's the Bay Area. And north of the Bay Area was Russian territory. Then those crafty Americans got in there eventually. You know.
The converts?
Actually, there were converts.
Yeah.
There were converts from very early on. So this brings us up into the 1870s. There were still very few churches in America at this time. There were a few Greeks, but they didn't associate with the Russians and they didn't go under the Russians. All the rest of the Orthodox went under the Russians. The Greek churches, it's kind of interesting, or the Greek communities that formed, many of them formed as Greek clubs. They formed having no bishop. And some of them specified in their bylaws that this parish is not under the authority of any bishop, and no bishop has any say in the operation of this parish. Yeah.
Lots of grace there.
Oh yeah. It was a. At the time there was a. They weren't sure whether they would be under the Church of Greece, under the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Greek Church didn't organize until 1923 in this country. But that's in a couple weeks from now. So 1870s. In the meantime, actually just a little bit later than this, we get to the reign of Alexander III. Now, his father, Alexander II, had been murdered by the Socialists. The Socialists consisted of a certain ethnic group who were, one contemporary author calls, a small people. In other words, they were mostly Jews. Not religious Jews. These were people who were atheists and who were alienated from everything. You know, they were nihilists. They were atheists. They were anti-establishment. They were filled with hatred.
Socialists.
What's that?
Socialists.
They were socialists. And they were, at this time in Russia, there was a huge Jewish population. but they were under considerable amounts of government restriction as to what kind of occupations they could have, where they could own land, what kind of land they could own, what kind of, you know, how, you know, where they, what kind of position they could have in the society. And so the general Jewish population chafed under these restrictions, but at the same time, they also thrived. And they were quite successful. However, there was this whole group from that population that was deeply alienated and had turned to socialism. Marxism was just becoming known, and because Marx was, what, he died, what, about 1870, thereabouts? 1860, 1870. But his, you know, his philosophy was something that many of these alienated groups seized on, and particularly this alienated group of Jewish intellectuals or intelligentsia. And so it became rather widespread. And so in the 1880s, Alexander III had 1.4 million Jews expelled from Russia and sent to New York. It's the single largest immigration into the United States of a single ethnic group.
It was forced immigration?
Essentially a forced immigration. So you want to see it in the arts? Look at Fiddler on the Roof. That's this forced immigration is exactly what it was about. And you see the antipathy towards Christianity. You see the antipathy towards the Tsar. You see the, you know, the hatred of Christianity. And of course, this is one of the most popular musicals in American culture, historically. That only complicated things. And it would bear bitter fruit. But one of the reasons that these people were expelled is because so many of them were affected by this, were involved in this whole socialist movement. Now, this is not an anti-Jewish thing. This is just the history.
So, but he didn't send away enough, because
No,
as you know,
the
there's a lot involved in the revolution.
the rest came in the 1990s.
Oh, they came back?
No, well, no, the rest of the Jews in Russia came in the 1990s. Or
100 years.
Something like, what, 5 million of them in the 1990s?
No,
In
I'm
the late
talking
Soviet
about
period,
one-
they were the ones who could
I am
act.
talking about the one that were there during the revolution in Russia. So you had Jewish people taking part of it.
There were Jews, not the Jews, but there were Jews who had huge roles in the Russian Revolution.
Yes.
Huge roles.
Even from New York.
They came back from New York. Oh, they were doing that from New York.
Yeah.
Jews or Zionists?
Well, these were just
Jewish
the Zionists. That's something else.
Okay.
They were communists, and this whole leftist political ideology, the whole socialist, Marxist, communist, whatever, it's all part of it was very much tied in with the Jewish leadership, in the Bolshevik Party. So this, which is rather unfortunate, shall we say.
Yeah.
So, going back to Orthodoxy in America, and let's see, what time is it? 9:08. Starting in, okay, in the 18, okay, remember the cathedral was in San Francisco was established in 1872. The railroads were just being finished and people were going back and forth, and it was relatively easy to get, from coast to coast, and but there was still not massive immigration. The immigrations began. There were immigrations, but a lot of the immigration, especially that affected the Orthodox Church, was in the 1880s. Not from Russia. There were actually very few immigrants from Russia in the 19th century. The largest number of, aside from that group of Jews in the 1880s, very few Russians. The Russians only started in a number of immigrations in the 20th century with the the Revolution and Civil War in the 20s, after the Second World War, and in the 1990s. So the 20s, the 40s, early 50s, and the 1990s. Other than that, the Russian immigration here has been very small. However, there were huge numbers of immigrants coming from Western Ukraine and areas that were in the Austro-Hungarian Empire called Carpatho-Russia. Many of whom were brought over essentially as indentured servants to coal and steel companies. In addition, there were immigrants from Southern Europe as well, and from the Middle East, from Greece and from Syria, from the Balkans. There was a huge number of Serbian miners who came, and they settled both in Illinois and in California.
Butte, Montana.
Eventually in Butte, Montana. But the biggest concentrations were California and Illinois. And Syrians, a lot of whom somehow ended up in Wichita, of all places. But there was huge Syrian community in Brooklyn. And then the Syrians also spread through, Syro-Lebanese spread throughout a lot of the Northeast. And the Greeks went everywhere. And so parishes started developing. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of this was in the 1880s, when there was this huge migration of Carpatho-Russians from Austro-Hungary, Slovakia area, to Minneapolis. And they formed a big parish, and they needed a priest. And so they called over this very eminent priest by the name of Father Alexis Toth. He was a senior archpriest. He'd been the dean of the seminary. He was widowed, and he came over to serve this parish in Minneapolis, which had several thousand people. And at the time, these people were not Orthodox. They were Greek Catholic. They were Uniates. Most of that emigration from the Austro-Hungarian Empire were Uniates. Well, the Uniate churches had no organization here in North America. So, as a priest, he went to the local bishop and presented his credentials. And the bishop, whose name was John Ireland, looked him up and down, and here is this big, late middle-aged, bearded priest in a in a Slavic cassock and big cross, and who'd been married, and he said, "Go away, go back to wherever you came from. We don't want you here. You have no blessing to serve here. You have no blessing to be here, and you may not." So, here that parish had brought over this priest at rather substantial expense, and they were shocked. Now John Ireland ended up as the leader of what came to be known in the Roman Catholic Church as the Americanist heresy.
Oh, wow.
And that created all sorts of problems. But we have John Ireland, Bishop John Ireland, to thank for the conversion of thousands and thousands of people to Orthodoxy, or the return to Orthodoxy, because Father Alexis went back to the parish council, I suppose, to the people at the church, and told them what had happened, and they said, "Okay, well, we know there's a Russian bishop in San Francisco. You have to let's go to him." And his name was Vladimir at the time, and so this was around 1888, and so he began, and he presented himself, was received into the Orthodox Church, and the whole parish was received into the Orthodox Church, and it began a movement of over 300 parishes into Orthodoxy from the Uniates. And this formed the core of the Russian mission at the end of the 19th century. That movement of Uniates into Orthodoxy continued up through the 1930s. There was a group in the 1930s that went under Constantinople, and that today is known as the Carpatho-Russian Diocese. But that also was a group of Carpatho-Russian Uniates who returned to the Orthodox Church. Of course, there was no catechism, and nobody bothered to tell them that there was any difference between being Russian Orthodox and Ukrainian Greek Catholic. And on the whole, on one level, there's not. It kind of looks the same mostly, and the cut of vestments is a little different, but the Greek Catholics were very Latinized. Even though the Russian Orthodox Church had gone through this Latin captivity thing, it still looked, felt, smelled like the Russian Orthodox Church. Well, the Greek Catholic Church from far western Ukraine had been under Latin influence, and so there were all sorts of odd things. They would call their archpriests Monsignor. They separated. I don't know if they separated baptism and chrismation, but they wouldn't give children communion until they were 7 years old. There were a lot of Latinisms. They would do masses for the dead every day during Lent. Of course, it's forbidden in the Orthodox Church to celebrate the liturgy during Lent, on the weekdays of Lent. And all these practices, read novenas, and they're not bad practices. They're just not our tradition. And so there was a whole learning curve. Now there were also communities, and many of them were Carpatho-Russians, in such disparate places as Calhan, Colorado, and Hartshorn, Oklahoma. Hartshorn, and these were basically mining communities or something like that. In Hartshorn, Oklahoma, there was a town there 120 years ago 150 years ago, but there's nothing much left. But so you're driving along on this Oklahoma country road, and there's a Russian Orthodox church. You know, complete with cupola and, you know, beautiful little church, you know, and with a hall and, you know, and a few houses in what used to be a village. But one of the most important priests from that era, Father Alexander Hadovitsky, and or may have been Father John Kachurov, one of the two. Hadovitsky was New York, right?
Yes.
Okay, it was Father John Kachurov. Would travel there from Chicago every other week to Oklahoma to serve the liturgy. Now, can you imagine going from Chicago to rural Oklahoma every other week?
Wow.
I mean, even today, it's a daunting, you know, daunting thing. Father John Kachurov also built a rather remarkable cathedral in Chicago, and it was designed by one of the great American architects, Louis Sullivan, and it's a kind of a landmark today.
What's the name?
The name of the church, I think, is Holy Trinity. Yeah, cathedral. It's in the hands of the OCA. We'll get into the whole OCA ROCOR split when we get into.
You didn't say anything about the Antioch church.
Right. Oh, I'm getting there. Father, let's see. So there was this huge movement of uniates into Orthodoxy, and around 1895, I think, 97, there was a new bishop assigned, and his name was Tikhon, and who went to San Francisco to take up his throne in the cathedral there, and to admit he was a young bishop, you know, fairly newly minted, and he began, but his diocese was all of North America, basically. So he was rather busy, and so he traveled all over the continent, establishing churches, consecrating churches, and ministering to all of these disparate communities of people, which were composed of all sorts of different ethnic groups. Now, around 1865 in San Francisco, there was born a child by the name of Sebastian Dabovich, and he was raised at the cathedral in San Francisco, of Serbian background, and he was assigned by Patriarch Tikhon to start consolidating the communities of Serbs. And so he started establishing Serbian pulling the Serbian population together and establishing churches which were Serbian style within the Russian Orthodox mission. And so one of the first churches that he established was in Jackson, which is in the Sierra foothills. And then he basically went all over the country establishing churches. Butte, Montana, I believe, and others. St. Tikhon traveled to the plains of Colorado. He consecrated the church in Denver, and Holy Transfiguration Cathedral. He traveled up to Seattle, and I don't know if he consecrated. I think St. Spiridions is a little bit later, but he went to a place called Wilkinson, which is a little tiny town on the side of Mount Rainier, and he consecrated the church there. An old friend of mine is the pastor there, And so he had me, at one time, he had me crawl under the altar table to look at St. Tikhon's signature on the crossbeam of the altar table. That was pretty neat. Then there's a church that St. Tikhon visited and consecrated far out on the eastern plains of Colorado, which is actually Father Silouan's home church. And the name escapes me right now of the town, but it's basically they're now all ranchers. They're Carpatho-Russian Colorado ranchers.
Wow. It's just outside of Springs, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, 60 miles.
Isn't it east?
Yeah, 60 miles east. And so one of the parishioners once told me that they said, well, you know, he didn't. Their current priest wasn't too popular at the time, but he said, and you know, we out here we didn't know anything about Orthodoxy, and we just thought it was something that our grandparents had made up.
Oh my.
So here they were, this bunch of ranchers, way in Calhan, way out on the plains of eastern Colorado, and they were so isolated that they had even forgotten their Carpatho-Russian roots. So, I mean, it's just really quite amazing. And there are actually two churches in the town of Calhan, which is the size of, like, I don't know, it's like a four corners with, and one of them was consecrated by St. Tikhon. Now, so St. Tikhon inherited a diocese when he came in 1897 that was burgeoning. There were already many parishes in Alaska, but very few clergy. And that was a huge problem, a huge deficit. There were many churches scattered across North America, and in the Northeast there was this huge number of ex-unit Carpatho-Russian churches. There were a few Russian enclaves. Now another group was the Syrians, and St. Tikhon blessed Father Raphael Hawawini, who was a Syrian who had been educated in Russia and was a priest of the Russian Orthodox mission, to go and to consolidate the Arab communities. And so Brooklyn was his first, and there remains a huge Arabic cathedral, which is now, I believe, the main cathedral of the Antiochian Archdiocese. And he established the foundations of what would become the Antiochian Archdiocese. However, it's important to remember that this was not, there were no jurisdictions at this time. There was one united American church under the Russian Orthodox Church, under one bishop or one archbishop, and St. Tikhon had this vision for the church in America, that it would be multi-ethnic, multilingual, and that it was open to converts. It was open to people of all different ethnic backgrounds. There were specific ministries to groups of, who shared particular ethnic backgrounds, but there were also churches where people of multiple backgrounds would come together, where English would be used in the liturgy, where the gospel was preached in English, and from the 1870s onward, there was a flow of converts into the church. Now, I don't know what the earliest translations look like. it was, but in around the year 1900, St. Tikhon was involved, being bishop. He was bishop of all of North America, even though his see was San Francisco. He would go to New York and everywhere else, because the center of gravity of the diocese turned into New York. And he encountered the Episcopalians and got to know the Episcopalians, who were very kind to the Orthodox, and especially the high church Episcopalians, and especially at the newly being developed Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And they allowed the Orthodox to use space in Episcopal churches. Of course, they had an agenda. And, but at the time, the Orthodox priests were telling people, if you can't go to an Orthodox church, go to an Anglican church, go to an Episcopal church, because it's American Orthodoxy. It's the American Orthodox Church. And what began was a kind of a, shall we say, a courtship, almost, by the Anglicans of Orthodoxy. But that's for another. But it's very interesting. And I'll bring a picture for the latest, one of the more recent aspects of that dance. Anyway, so let's see. Are we too late? It's 9:30. Are there any questions? Is this kind of clear? Does it make sense? How all these various threads are kind of coming together?
Are you going to cover when the Western Rite came in and that later?
Yeah, that really wasn't developed until much later.
Okay.
Until St. John of San Francisco.
Okay.
It was present, but so remind me about the whole thing of St. Tikhon and the Anglicans. Anyway, in 1906 there was the big San Francisco earthquake, and the cathedral fell down and burned, and it had to be rebuilt. So St. Tikhon began the process of rebuilding, but he transferred the see to New York, and he developed a synod of bishops. A North American synod of bishops to take care of this multi-ethnic diocese. So there was Bishop Raphael of Brooklyn, for the Arabs. Sebastian was never consecrated a bishop, but there was a plan for a bishop for the Serbs. There was a plan for the bishop of the Greeks. There was a bishop for Alaska. There was going to be another bishop in San Francisco. And his vision was an entire North American archdiocese that was an autonomous church under the Russian Orthodox Church. At this time, it was still largely supported by the Russian Missionary Society. There was imperial patronage flowing, building churches and paying clergy and all of that kind of stuff. The units were returning to Orthodoxy. We can only whisper to them that they were converts. I don't think they like that idea, but they are. And there were converts flowing in. The first black priest was in the 1890s.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's and only he was with the Greeks. And so you had this whole canonical structure of an archdiocese under the Russians. Then you had all these independent little Greek churches, all scattered all over the country. Now, one thing I didn't get into, we missed it by about 100 years, was the initial presence of Orthodox in America, which was in the 1740s, 30s and 40s, and that was in colonial Virginia. Wow. There was a planter by the name of Philip Ludwell, who was the local aristocrat, who built a huge manor house called Green Spring, and which no longer exists, and was torn down a couple hundred years ago because it was built in the 1870s or 1770s, or no, 1740s probably, 30s or 40s, and he became and he and his whole family had been received into the Russian Orthodox Church in London.
Wow.
There were 10 major families that were received, British families that were received into the Russian Orthodox Church in the London Cathedral. He took his daughter, he had his life here. He took his daughters back to London to be chrismated, and so there's a lot that we don't know about that. But his townhouse in Williamsburg is there. It's privately occupied right now, but it has this rather odd thing. There's an apse in the basement. It's a kind of your typical two-story rectangular house, right? Except there's an apse in the basement, in the brick of the basement. I wonder what that could be. On the east side.
On the east side, of course.
He translated huge amounts of the services into English. This was in the 1740s. He was related to George Washington. He was related to Robert E. Lee. He was related to like the who's who of early America, both colonial and post-revolutionary. So there was another group of Orthodox who did land in America. They were Greek indentured servants. They'd probably been bought as slaves. My guess is from the Ottomans. Slavery was not an ethnic thing. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about blacks. It was about servitors, workers, and they were brought over by either a relative or a close associate of Philip Ludwell, who was in Virginia, but they landed in Florida, and so there's this big monument to these Greeks who came over, like in the 1740s, 30s or 40s, and founded St. Augustine, Florida. Well, they didn't found it, but they were they landed at St. Augustine, Florida, and established a little Greek community which soon became Roman Catholic. So Orthodoxy in America is very interesting, and there's a lot to go. Okay. is truly meet to bless thee, Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, without corruption that gavest birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever into ages of ages. Amen.
Peace, Despotan.